Our final concept for this module is the concept of sin and brokenness. Now, the concept of sin is one which, of course, is a very tricky one for us to understand, and one which you will learn more about in another course, which is the course on what we believe, a course in theology. And we'll be talking about some of those concepts there. But I need you to understand a little bit more about the concept of sin within the Tanakh in order to have an understanding of it. The concept of sin in the Old Testament or the Tanakh really has no concept of an original sin, as if somehow what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden is put down each generation to each concept. And so it's therefore different to a lot of evangelical theology. A lot of evangelical theology believes that there's an original sin, that we're born sinful. In fact, the Tanakh's understanding of sin is much less directed to the individual and much more to the community. There's an understanding more of a corporate sin than there is of an individual sin. And therefore, forgiveness also has to take place less as an individual and more in a corporate framework. What we need to see is, for example, the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was less about the sin of an individual as much as the corporate sin of the people. And a recognition that maybe we haven't always done what God has wanted us to do. That we haven't always lived the way God has wanted us to live. That we haven't been in relationship. That we haven't been a blessing to God or ourselves or others in as much as God would have wanted us to be. And so what we realize with that is that that's part of the problem that we face with the Bible. That the Bible is wanting, or it's particularly the Tanakh, is wanting to encourage us rather than to punish us. It's wanting to restore us rather than to just remind us constantly of our sinfulness. In a sense, the Tanakh's understanding of sin has got more to do with brokenness than it has to do with the sense of taint or of being dirty. It's less about dirty and much more about saying that we are broken, that we're somehow less than what God intended us to be. We can see that, of course, from Genesis chapter 1, where in Genesis chapter 1 we have said that we have been made in the image of God. By Genesis chapter 2, we realize that that image has been broken. That somehow we're not quite what God wanted us to be. That we're not quite living out the intent of being made in that image. And so in fact what we need to do is to reconnect with who God is. We reconnect with what God would want us to be. So when you read the concept of sin within the Tanakh, let's not read it as being our individual sins, like where I haven't done this or I've done that or I've broken this commandment or broken that commandment. It's less about breaking the commandments. And it's more about realizing that our breaking of them has to do with our brokenness. And that what God would want to do is wanting us to restore us back to what He intended, back to Genesis chapter 1, rather than a focus on Genesis chapter 2 and 3. A focus, and particularly on 3, where we are kicked out of Eden. That wasn't God's intent. God's intent was us to live with Him in His presence, in His life, in His transformative power. In many ways, when we look at the Newer Testament then, we realize that Jesus has come not so much to deal with our individual breaking of commandments, but rather to deal with the brokenness that causes us to break them in the first place. He's wanting to deal with the cause rather than with the symptoms of our life. He's wanting to restore our true humanity. Because it's in our true humanity that we live out the image of God within us. And not just within us, but through us into the world. Where again we continue to then live as the blessing that God intended us to be.